So, hi Graham. As Rachel said, I mean, you're a man that probably needs little introduction in this market. You are very, very well known for your Asia Tech podcasts, and also you produce the Asia Matters report.
Thank you.
So why should I, as an idiot European, barely, idiot British person, but yeah, English person probably, it's going through some stuff, my country is going through some stuff, why should I be sitting up and taking notice of Asia? What's happening?
Okay, so we're going to talk about Asia on the macro level. And by the way, just a caveat, I've done about 270 interviews on Asia Tech podcasts, and I've rarely sat on the other side, so I always curl up a little bit when I'm being interviewed. So, all right, I'll do my best. So why are we talking about Asia? I think we've got to talk about Asia for a number of reasons. I mean, at the very macro level, Asia is a $27 trillion market. You know, at the very basic level, that's 50% bigger than the EU, 50% bigger than the US. So financially, it's the biggest market in the world. So, you know, obviously that's where the ad dollars will go, because that's where the money is at the moment. So you can break that down, and I'm sure we'll talk about that as well. You can talk about the Asian middle classes, you can talk about Asia to Asia trade, and you can talk about how, I'm sure we're going to talk about this as well, how Asia's now becoming a world leader in innovation. I'm sure we can talk a bit about big data and AI and so on.
Yes, we certainly will. I want to kick off with so Asia is, as a region, is going through some stages.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to kind of hear what those stages are, where we're at and where we're heading.
Stages. So I think we're at a really interesting time in Asia. I mean, if you look at it historically, where we are, we're at sort of the end of the American century, which has lasted more or less 100 years, hence the name, which sort of went from the end of the First World War up until now, when, you know, the old world was bankrupt and America took over, and you had Ford and Edison and all these kind of like innovative minds out there. And before that, you had the British century, which lasted 100 years, which went from the Battle of Waterloo, you know, the dominance of Britain in Europe, and then that was 100 years, all the way up to the American century. And we're now 100 years later, we're sort of at the nexus point of the Asian century, and it's starting to happen now. And I think people get it, some people understand it's kind of happening, but, you know, like with the end of the British century moving into the American century, people didn't realize it. People still thought that the old world was more important. And it's kind of, we're in this transition period now. So we're starting to see really interesting insights into how Asia is sort of pushing ahead in technology, in economics and so on. So, you know, looking forward to diving into that a little bit.
And you mentioned briefly earlier kind of the Asian middle class. Like, so, you know, what's been the development of that, and how is that affecting kind of, you know, why Asia is an important market to be looking at, region to be looking at?
So, I mean, this is why we're here, right? The Asian middle class, this is the gold mine. So I've lived a number of years. I mean, I first moved to Japan in 1995, when sort of Japan was going to be the biggest market in the world, and it never kind of happened. But it sort of grew a middle class, and then the middle class sort of disappeared. And then there was this phenomenon in the last few years, which I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with, from Japan, and it was called, in Japanese, if we have any Japanese people here, it's called bakugai, which means, if you break it down in Japanese, baku means explode, and gai is a conjugation of to shop. So it's explosive shopping, and it was a term used by Japanese retailers about Chinese. So this bakugai phenomenon was, you know, a busload of Chinese tourists coming to Tokyo and the Louis Vuitton store, and they closed down the Louis Vuitton store and they empty it out. So that was a phenomenon that started appearing in the newspapers in Japan sort of 4 or 5 years ago. So that's the sort of the tip of the spear, if you like, of the Asian middle class. We're starting to see it happening in the media, and the numbers really back it up. I mean, if you think about it, look at where we are with Asian middle classes, and we talked about it in the first session as well, which, you know, talking about washing machines and laundry detergents, and, you know, these are going to be people buying this stuff now. By 2030, 2/3 of the world's middle class will be in Asia. Just think about that. 2/3 of the world's middle class. They've gone from 700 million in 2009 to, predicted by 2030, 3.2 billion middle class. So
that's terrifying.
That's a 500%, if my maths is right, or 400% growth rate in 21 years. So in 2 decades, right? It's gone up 5 times. So think about all those people coming online and looking for, as we mentioned earlier, like laundry detergent, or, you know, like a washing machine. So where do they go? I mean, obviously that's a gold mine for advertisers right now.
And I do want to kind of delve into the commerce side of things, because commerce in this region is from my perspective, mental.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating. When Amazon launched Amazon Go in Seattle a few months ago, I mean, I was having a chat with our APAC editor, Aline, and she said everyone in Singapore was just rolling their eyes because everyone in the West is so excited about it, but Alibaba's been doing this for years.
Yeah.
And why are companies like Alibaba able to do what they're doing when it comes to retail, and why can the likes of Amazon actually break through into that?
I mean, let's talk about Alibaba, for example. Is anybody here familiar with the 11/11? Right, okay, so a few of you. So for those that don't know, 11/11 is what they call Singles Day in China. And it's like a big event. So like my Chinese friends will all sort of build up to it. It's like, oh yeah, this is 11/11's coming. What's that? Oh, it's a shopping day. Okay, what's all that about? So they're going to have all these discounts on Alibaba's different platforms, right? So it's sort of a big festival. They've turned it into a festival. And what it is Alibaba is just sort of promoting every single retailer on Alibaba during this time, and everybody's discounting, and everybody's getting excited about it, and people are going into the offices talking about what they're going to buy on 11/11 and all these kind of things. And on one day, I think if you look at the numbers, they did $25 billion worth of business in one single day. One single day on Alibaba. I mean, that's to answer your question, why we should take notice of Alibaba. And I think at their height, they were doing something like 800,000 transactions a second. It was just crazy. I mean, like their peak, they had a peak period within an hour where, they still managed to do it. The server didn't crash. So those are the kind of numbers which, I mean, obviously we're used to Amazon's expansion, but when you talk about Alibaba, it's completely on a different level.
Yeah, Amazon pales in comparison to Alibaba. And you've got interesting things like, there's other kind of, obviously you've got BAT and you've got JD.com, and you've got, what interests me is there seems to be almost like an Asia to Asia type trade happening, that they're almost self-sufficient and don't really need us Westerners anymore. It's a great way of telling Trump to bugger off. But what... do they have interest? Do these companies have interest in the West? Are they looking to get into the West, or are they completely happy with focusing on the opportunities in this region?
Has Alibaba been interested in the West? So yeah, I think he was talking to Trump the other day, wasn't he? So Jack Ma, I mean, you're familiar with Jack Ma now. He's that guy with the funny face who's always, he speaks good English as well. I mean, he was an English teacher, right? I believe his background. He was an English teacher. So he speaks pretty good English. He was at Davos and he was talking to Trump. And he said to Trump, I mean, this is, in the context of the conversation, Trump is talking about China as stealing jobs from America. So Jack Ma goes to America and he says that Alibaba is going to be the biggest employer of Americans within 20 years. Can you think about that? He says he's going to employ or make, not employ, 1 million jobs for Americans through their Taobao platform. So I think that's very interesting. What happens is, if you look at history, what has happened with countries going west. I mean, the Japanese is a good example in the 80s, like with all the manufacturers. It takes one, and when one goes west, they all look at that first pioneer, and it de-risks the whole generation to come through. So everybody knows Jack Ma. Can you name another Chinese entrepreneur? I mean, Pony Ma. No, do you know Pony Ma? Anybody heard of Pony Ma? Exactly. Well, he's the founder of Tencent.
3 people.
Yeah, Tencent. So Tencent are, probably the second most valuable company in Asia right now. So, $200 billion valuation, but nobody knows. So we're now waiting for that generation to come through. So once Jack Ma has sort of established Alibaba and de-risked it for everybody, and then people are used to seeing Chinese entrepreneurs and Chinese brands in the West, a whole generation will come through behind them.
And what about going in the other direction? What about the West investing in the APAC region?
Yeah, I mean, so Google has recently invested 500 million, was it, in JD?
I think it was 750, but it was paltry compared to...
Is that Sing dollars or
yeah,
US
well,
dollars?
actually, a good point. I think it's US dollars, I can't remember.
Okay.
I should check my facts on that one, probably, making up numbers.
So, I mean, Google's obviously investing and trying to get into China with difficulty, obviously. I mean, it's a closed market. But I think that the bigger question is about the Asia to Asia market now. I mean, must be on the minds of advertisers all over the world, because if you think about it now, that middle class that we talked about, those 3.2 billion people, and that $27 trillion economy, who's going to service those people? So now, if you look at the stats, Asia does more trade with itself than it does with the rest of the world. So the Asia to Asia trade, if you look at it, is the biggest concern now. So what's kind of happening is that we've always thought of Asia as like cheap garments and shoes and knockoff phones and all those kind of things. That's what it was. I mean, for a certain generation in the 80s, you know, it was always like T-shirts and stuff like that. But it's changing. And what's happening now is that Asia is servicing itself. So Asian brands are able to service Asian consumers. And with that goes the technology as well. So the question is where does the West fit into that? You know, if we come in here, you know, thinking that, well, you know, they're here to sort of manufacture stuff for us, that's all changing. You know, in the last 5 years, we've seen that shift. And I think what's happening now is that the Asian brands are getting a lead technologically in how they're servicing the Asian consumers.
I mean, the technology piece is extremely interesting because if you think about the kind of the APAC region, it just seems to be infinitely more tech savvy than the rest of the world, basically. I mean, particularly with a lot of the kind of ASEAN markets are, you know, mobile first, so they're just so far up on technology from that perspective. And there seems to be a lot more scope to be able to do things with consumers. It feels like the value exchange between I'm giving my data away, but I know I'm getting something good in return. I'm getting something targeted, something relevant. It feels like it's much more understood in this region. Would you agree with that?
That's an interesting question. Value exchange. I mean, so for example, if you went to China and you asked Chinese consumers, are you know, I've got to tread carefully here diplomatically, are you confident about your leadership? I think they have like the highest ranking in the world for confidence in brands and sort of figures of authority. Now, whether or not that means they are or not, or that's what they're just reporting, is a different matter.
Yeah.
So it's a different matter. But the point being is that about the value exchange, if you go to China, it's a lot easier for Tencent, Alibaba, etc. to gather data than it is. I mean, look at what's happened in Facebook just recently. I mean, gathering data has just caused a huge problem. But in China, this is going on all the time. So the question is are they doing it because they are more respectful of the consumer, or just because they can get away with it?
I don't think it's anything to do with respect for the consumer. It's just because they can and it's available.
Possibly.
But I guess the flip side of that is, does the consumer understand that? I mean, if they don't, will they wise up?
Well, yeah, so if they do or they don't, the point is that they're gathering data. And if you look now, SenseTime, which is a facial recognition company originally based in Hong Kong, but invested in by Alibaba and Temasek here in Singapore. So SenseTime is now the most valuable AI startup in the world. And it's been mooted that, you know, the next $1 trillion company will be an AI startup, right? So if there ever was going to be one, it's going to be that company or one like it. So the interesting thing about SenseTime is they gather facial imagery, and they have, I believe, a database of 2 billion images, 2 billion faces, 2 billion images. So what is happening with that imagery? On the one hand, on the positive side for advertisers, I mean, it's all good, I suppose, for advertisers, is that you can walk into a retail store in China, and if you're an existing customer, it will know who you are, and therefore, you know, it will know your loyalty programs, it's know your buying habits and all those kind of things. So from a customer experience, or, you know, a lot of people talk about offline to online and so on, in that terms, it's much better for an advertiser and a retailer. And then there's the dark side of all of that as well. But the point is, whether or not it's good or bad, they're leading in that respect. They have 2 billion images.
Happening. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I find it fascinating. I find it terrifying, really. To me, that really creeps me out. But I guess, you know, from the perspective of, well, I don't experience it because we don't really have much of that stuff going on in the West. People are trying, but it's difficult because there is a day's challenge, and that seems like that day's challenge.
Well, we just don't know about it.
Well, that's true. Yeah, probably more that. But the data challenge doesn't seem to exist as much here. And again, sort of moving to the technology piece, kind of how does this affect kind of the advertising and marketing industry? I mean, you've talked about advertisers. I mean, we've talked about kind of acquisitions and what the future of ad tech is here. It just seems really buoyant in this region. There's a lot of people being very bullish, a lot of ad tech companies, a lot of advertisers being very bullish about APAC. And you've got, you know, kind of telcos like Singtel, for example, that have acquired the likes of Amobi and Turn over the years. What does this kind of surge in the population, surge in this tech-savvy consumerism, the young population, mean for ad tech and martech?
That's a big question. I'm not an ad tech guy, so I'm not going to teach you how to do your business or tell you about it. All I know is about the numbers and what's happening. And I think, you know, we're seeing something very interesting, and that is obviously it's a huge growth market. But, you know, what's kind of happening is that what was traditionally for Western brands and Western technology is now being, that sort of battleground is being lost to domestic brands, domestic technology. I mean, just in terms of the innovation side, look at what's happening. I mean, SenseTime, obviously, as an example, what are the implications of that for ad tech? What are the implications of that for retail as well? I mean, look, for example, at O2O. I mean, if you go to China or Hong Kong now, everybody's talking about O2O. You know, if it's retail, it's O2O, it's offline to online, online to offline. Everybody's talking about that sort of integrated consumer experience. So I think, I mean, if you go back to what's happening outside of Asia, you know, I think Asia's ahead in that sense, you know, in terms of the technology, in terms of the numbers. I don't know how that translates to ad tech, but that's where we are in the technology side.
Well, I think it does translate to ad tech very well. And, you know, the conversations we've been having the past sort of day and a half very much sort of tie into that this is a place where it's all going on, which is exciting, very exciting. And I guess, obviously, you are bullish and kind of confident about the future of the APAC region. And, you know, when we talk about the stages and we're kind of, you know, in a sort of transition period, moving into stage 4, you've talked about SenseTime, kind of how can this region lead in the kind of future technology? And also, you know, what can the West learn from that?
That's really interesting. What can the West learn? I mean, let's look at history, what's happened. If you take automotive as an example, you know, who leads in the automotive world? I mean, it just changes all the time now. But if you go way back, you know, if you look at the first German automotive manufacturers, these guys were craftsmen. You know, they weren't thinking about big-scale mass industrial automation. They were talking about crafting art. But it took the French. The French took the German technology and made it work. And then the Americans, so Henry Ford, looked at the French technology and said, okay, we can make an industrial process out of that. And then the Japanese copied the Americans and so on, and it goes around. And I think we're seeing a similar process here in Asia. Asia's looking at the West, when looking at what Google and Facebook have achieved and borrowing that technology and making it better. And now I think they're doing a better job of it. So in terms of, you know, what can we learn? I mean, there's so much we can learn. I think, take, for example, what happened recently, like Alibaba launched a store in Thailand, on the Taobao store. And they put, I mean, durians obviously is a bit of a controversial subject here in Singapore, but they put durians on the Taobao platform, and they sold out of those durians. They sold 80,000 durians in 60 seconds. 80,000 durians in 60 seconds on the Taobao platform. Who was buying it? Chinese. So Chinese consumers were buying durians, importing them from Thailand back to China. And they sold out in a minute. So what can we learn? I suppose we just got to watch and learn, because it's happening. And we don't understand these kind of scales of, you know, the commerce that are happening right now and in Asia compared to what's happening in the West. But I think the main thing is just to get in there, understand it, you know, lose the preconceptions of what the West and Asia is, and just understand that this is happening, it's happening right now, and there's a change going on. There's an inflection point in history, a geopolitical shift as well, but certainly in the technological era.
It's absolutely fascinating. I'm afraid we are out of time. I could probably chat to you all day. But just for that, I saw a few raised eyebrows in the room from people that aren't from this region. What in the world are durians?
Durians? Where do I start? Well, there's a great, if you walk down to Singapore Esplanade, there's a great big one, isn't there? So. Okay, durians, how do I explain it? If you're not from, come on, who knows what a durian is? Put your hand up. All right, so just ask the person vomit, next to you at break over coffee.
It's the one that tastes like vomit.
Well, I think that, yeah, it's an acquired taste, let's put it that way. So.
I want to say thank you so much for your time, Graham. That's been absolutely fascinating. Round of applause for Graham, please.